This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett, and today I'm joined by two very special guests, Jessica Getman and Evan Ware, and they are two of the three editors of a new book about music in Star Trek.
Nice to be here.
Good to talk to you both, finally. I think this is the first time we've actually kind of spoken virtually in person, but we've met electronically because, funnily enough, I played a small part in the in the gestation of your book because I ended up copy editing it. I used to do a lot of copy editing for Routledge, the academic publisher, and I still get these emails now and then that generally kind of go straight into my trash folder. But this one came through for a book about Star Trek, and I was like, okay, right, I'm definitely doing that one. And I really enjoyed it. It was a fascinating book for me. Some of our listeners will know I am not musically trained. I'm not, I'm by no means an expert on this sort of thing, but I love, when other people bring their expertise to Star Trek and kind of are able to shine light on it in a different way, whether that's design or music or whatever.
It was certainly great to have someone who knew Star Trek copy editing the book, because you were able to bring up some very specific things about some very specific episodes. And I remember thinking, like, wow, this is like the royal treatment we're getting from Routledge here. So it was very cool.
I think that was more good luck, to be honest. I wouldn't expect that level of knowledge in future. Like I say, I mean, when I handed it over at the end, I did say to them, look, maybe for the proofreader, you should find someone who reads music because I can kind of cope with one side of this, but the other is way out of my field of expertise. But it's a fascinating subject, and it's one that I don't think has been covered all that much in detail, certainly from an academic perspective. And we used to have a show on Trek FM called Melodic Treks that was very popular, and people loved that because we played a lot of Trek music and so on. But that was very much from a kind of fan's perspective, not from a kind of musicological perspective. But this book, I think, is really interesting because you really go quite deep into some of the kind of obvious topics and some pretty kind of out there topics as well. I'm kind of curious, what brought the three of you, because you have another co-editor as well who works on the book with you, what brought the three of you together, and what was it that made you decide that this was the book that you needed to pull together?
Yeah, well, our other editor is Brooke McCorkle Okazaki, who is also just a wonderful musicologist. And gosh, we all met many years ago. We've kind of known each other a very long time as musicologists. It's a small world. More particularly, we've probably come together on this topic connected to presentations at conventions, specifically the Society for the Cinema and Media Studies and the Music and the Moving Image conference as well. So that really brought us together. Although, I mean, I've known Evan for, 20 years now. Are we on 20 years now?
It'll be 20 years in 2028.
Oh, okay. 15 years now. So,
but as I recall, it was actually James DeVille's suggestion.
Really?
We do this. We were at the 2016 Society for Cinema and Media Studies conference in Atlanta, and we all did a panel with Michael. He was the only person. He was originally supposed to be an editor with us, but he wasn't able to make that work with his schedule. And we all presented on Star Trek there, and it was a lively presentation. People enjoyed it, and I remember James coming to us afterwards and saying, "Really, you should think of turning this into a book." And that's kind of where it all started.
I was just going to say, you're right, Duncan, that there's not a whole lot of books on the music of Star Trek quite yet. There's Jeff Bond's kind of his seminal Music of Star Trek, which is really, it's a kind of a quick overview of each of the films and shows up into the 90s with some interviews with the composers, really useful book, but there's not a lot that's very specifically on the music of Star Trek. And so this was, it was an attempt to get a lot of this in print and out there for the rest of the world. Because as scholars, as musicologists, many of us are Trekkies. There are just so many of us who love Star Trek and science fiction, and we're consistently giving papers to each other, you know, kind of going over these ideas with each other. But we really wanted to get some of that in print. So that's part of what we were doing here.
Give our listeners a bit of a sense of some of the kind of topics that come up in the book, because as I say, they're not necessarily the obvious ones. I mean, there are chapters about the various title themes, about, you know, the influence of different composers, these kind of topics that you mentioned. But there are, for example, there was a chapter that I loved about Majel Barrett and Lwaxana Troi as a kind of a sonic disruptor. I think maybe the way she was described as this kind of, particularly because she plays two characters. She plays the Enterprise computer and then she plays Lwaxana Troi. And in some scenes, they're even talking to each other. This sense of the kind of orality of the Star Trek universe. So I suppose taking music in quite a broad sense rather than a very literal sense. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that was the chapter by Josh Morrison. It was one of our favorites too. We were all very excited about that. He's a cinema studies, gender studies scholar, and he was definitely a great person to bring along to kind of look at sound and meaning in kind of from a different perspective than we would be equipped to as musicologists. So yeah, that was one of our favorites.
That was an important part of this book from the beginning, was that it should be about sound and music, because sometimes the boundary between those two concepts is a little bit blurry. Jessica and I have presented a paper on that exact topic in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, where there's the scene where Chekhov and Tyrell are on SETI Alpha 5 and you hear the beeping tricorder. Well, the beeping tricorder, that pitch actually organizes the pitches of the entire scene, right? So it's a part where James Horner and the sound editor were working really, really closely together. So there's this kind of porous boundary between what would be considered like a diegetic sound and a non-diegetic music that's accompanying it. So there was a lot of this work, I think, in the book about looking at stuff that was both diegetic, because the idea of music in the Star Trek universe is really important. Jessica's article touches on that with Data's violin playing, but then so does Sinatra in Space, one of my personal favorite articles. I'm a Sinatra scholar too, so I was very excited when Tim Summers proposed that one, and it's such a great chapter about how music from the golden era of like the American Songbook was used as a kind of a repository for healing and hope during the DS9 run, particularly during the Dominion War. And I just thought that was such a special way of looking at it, because I think we all tend to kind of default to thinking, you know, about the fanfare when you hear Star Trek music, right? But there's so much music in Star Trek, not just music about Star Trek.
Yeah, and it feels like, to me, I mean, just this week we've had the premiere of season 3 of Picard, and that's a show that seems to be leaning more into, you know, the kind of the songbook and so on. It's kind of leaning into that. I mean, from the very first shot of the first season through to this episode, there are like, I think 3 or 4 samples of music, whether it's this kind of mixtape that Picard has made for Beverly, or whether it's, you know, what he's listening to in his quarters. And obviously we've had this throughout Star Trek. And then Captain Shaw, who's got Chopin playing at dinner and is very snooty about Riker's jazz collection. It feels like the Star Trek universe, I mean, it's always been there, but certainly I'd say in Picard, it feels like maybe this is coming off Nemesis and the whole Blue Skies thing with Nemesis, but that's being folded in much more and becoming more a part of the texture of it somehow.
So I have to say, I haven't seen season 3 yet of Picard.
Okay.
So now I'm very excited. But I mean,
those don't count as spoilers, I don't think.
No, it just makes me more excited. Yeah. I do have to say, so like in Picard season 1, the shot of the Borg cube with the Romulan theme, because it's sorry, everybody, spoilers. It's been
it's okay. I think we'll get away with that.
Under control of the Romulans, right? So the playing of the Romulan theme from the original series was really, really cool. that was a moment of, I think everyone who's familiar with the original series just went ding. So that was pretty amazing. But I also have to say the short treks have been really great in that regard too, specifically Ephraim and Dot, I think.
Oh, I love that one.
Kind of a parody cartoon. Yeah, it was really, really good. And Lower Decks too, like the callbacks, the musical callbacks have been there's so many callbacks, of course, in Lower Decks, but the musical ones are the ones that I love. So that's been really fun. And it's really nice to have this sort of nostalgia, not just for the characters and not just for even the feel, right? Which a lot of the fans have been kind of wanting, with Strange New Worlds and Picard to a certain extent. But the nostalgia for the music and the sound too has been really nice. The fact that they've paid attention to that.
Well, I think if you haven't seen season 3 yet of Picard, you're definitely going to enjoy it, because there are a lot of, even for me as a non-musical person, there are musical callbacks that I was recognizing. I'm pretty sure there was a bit of Insurrection in there. There's bits of music from all over Star Trek. And in fact, in the end credits, because they moved the credits to the end, and as with all these new Trek series, they're filled with little clues and so on. And one of those clues is a line of music, which I have to say, meant nothing to me, as you know, because that's not my skill set. But I've seen various people online who have, whipped out their keyboards and played it, and it is indeed a significant piece of music that is going to kind of, in fact, be reprised because I've seen a few episodes ahead, is going to be reprised on screen later. That is a spoiler, I suppose, but it's a pretty oblique one later on in the season. So, there's a kind of interesting example of the music is almost giving clues, a bit like, I don't even know if this is true, but they always used to say the music to Inspector Morse. I don't know if you guys ever watched Inspector Morse. So the theme for Inspector Morse plays on this kind of Morse code thing. And apparently, if you understood Morse code, there were always clues. Like the theme was always slightly different for each episode, and there were clues to the identity of the murderer or whatever put in there. So it kind of interests me, this idea that you put clues in the music that maybe, whether they work, I guess for people who really understand music, they work on a conscious level. Maybe for other people, they work on an unconscious level. And I thought that was interesting because, Jessica, you wrote an essay in the book about AI characters. And I was quite struck by what you were saying about the difference in the way that data and lore were scored. And that as a kind of indication of, there's something dodgy about lore, even before we've kind of totally come to recognize that.
That's the great thing. I'm going to get a little meta here, but that's the great thing about music and narrative, I think, as a whole, is that music does, it gives us information that maybe we don't we aren't cognizant of what exactly we're being told, but we still take it in. So yeah, with the data and the lore music, even the fact that Data's music was meant to be something that was meant to be heard as computational, because it was drawing on this idea of like serialism, even though it wasn't quite serial, but it was drawing on this idea of serialism in the 12-tone row, right? That sort of thing. Even the idea of the original series with Spock's brain, right? Which I think I also talked about in this chapter, like the fugue, right, that Jerry Freed wrote for Spock's brain, right? This music that's meant to kind of tell us that, hey, here's something about this character you need to know. And that's really common in television and film. And most of the time when we're listening, we're not really listening, right, for that kind of stuff. But it certainly makes our lives a lot of fun as music theorists and musicologists, just in terms of there's always something to dig into, because the composers, even if they know that the listeners aren't always going to pick up everything, that kind of meaning is there. For
any of your listeners who aren't familiar with the term, right, fugue is when you have multiple different voices coming in with a similar melody. Bach wrote a lot of these things, right? So you might have a melody that starts up and it runs for a few seconds, and then another melody starts up in the same way and it runs for a few seconds, and then a third melody and sometimes a fourth melody. And if you're Mozart, you can do 8, because Mozart. So the idea of the fugue was known, in fact, as the learned style as far back as the 18th century. And so it had a connotation, even in the 18th century Europe, of being music that people who knew what they were doing would write. Right. So it had a kind of an intellectuality about it. And Bach, when he died, like everyone thought he was like a weird fuddy-duddy who was still writing fugues. No one does that anymore. And so to use that for Spock makes a lot of sense. Right. Spock and Bach, I mean, it rhymes. But there's a certain kind of meticulousness, a certain kind of, that kind of, people often talk about Bach's music in terms of logic. Right. Look at how these voices fit logically together and things like that. So there's a really long tradition of this, and that taps into something called topic theory in music, which are kind of how tropes get used, musical tropes get used over and over again in similar contexts. And I think that's part of the reason maybe why Star Trek music and Star Trek took a long time to come around, is because it took a long time for those theories to come in to musicology and music theory to be accepted, because musicology and music theory tend to be behind the times by about 25 to 30 years. And it's true. Like I'm not trying to be facetious, but critical theory comes into the English departments in the 70s, and it's not really hitting music departments until the turn of the century. So there's a lot of delay in music. It tends to be a conservative discipline. So it's taken a while, I think, for people to have the tools to be able to study this kind of music, but also to think that this music is worth studying at all.
Yeah, television music studies is really a newer discipline. At this point, maybe it's 15 to 20 years old, but that's still really young in terms of fields. And I do want to, Evan, can I go back to the idea of topic theory? And I think in particular, just this idea of the fugue kind of being this sort of musical topic. So again, it's this kind of musical reference to an outside idea, right? So this musical topic and it was something that Jerry Fried was really, really good at. Also, they all were very good at it. Fred Steiner was really good at it. But one of the things I really appreciated about Jerry Fried is that he was very purposeful in the music that he composed. So in this case, he wrote Spock's Fugue for Spock's Brain, and it was this reference to the learned style, right? This reference towards logic. But he also, when he wrote Amok Time, the music for Amok Time, the famous fight music that everyone knows, right? Yeah, exactly. He was pulling from the primitivistic style of Stravinsky, right? Mm-hmm. Like he knew that he was tapping into that musical topic, or that musical style that could be applied to the topic of primitivism, right? In order to create that specific type of music and create a specific sort of feel. And that was something most composers are going to be doing this, especially in film and television, because it relies so heavily on musical topic. But that was something I really liked about Jerry Fried, is that he didn't write the most music for the original series of Star Trek. That's definitely Fred Steiner, but I think his music is the music that people remember the most, barring the title cue by Sandy Courage. So I think because he was just really effective with that.
It's fun to see what Jeff Russo is doing now, because it's a very different world, right? When the next generation composers came in, Berman had like some really strong aesthetic leanings, right? The music should be kind of like tapestry behind the actors. It was never supposed to be as dramatic as it was in the original series. And in fact, like they really push back against the original series in a lot of ways. It starts to break out. Like by the time Deep Space Nine comes around, there's that episode where they find a planet that only shows up every 80 odd years, and Dax falls in love with someone. And the love theme in that episode is just delicious. Like one of the most most beautiful things I've ever heard in Star Trek. So they do start
and yet in a terrible episode.
Yeah. But they do start asserting
great work.
Yep.
Yeah.
They do start asserting themselves, but Jeff Russo really takes it to another level.
Right.
And I kind of feel like the I don't know this for sure, but I feel like Kurtzman et al. Have been really like hands off with him, have been just like, you do you, and let him really kind of tell a story. I think, for my money, the Picard theme from the first season was one of the best title cues ever written for Star Trek. It is impressive. And
again, a callback insofar as it reprises the Inner Light music, but in a very subtle way. I mean, not to labor the point, but like, this is not my wheelhouse, but I didn't even realize that until someone pointed it out to me. So it was obviously subtle enough that as someone who, watched The Inner Light plenty of times and heard that music and even been to like the Star Trek in concert and heard the whole suite for it and so on, that didn't register for me, but it did feel very appropriate, that theme. But I mean, the music obviously has changed massively over the 50 odd years. I mean, you were talking about musicology changing and catching up with the times. I mean, Star Trek has also been kind of catching up with the times, whether it's, when it came back with Discovery, it seemed to me there was this kind of Game of Thronesy style, which I struggled with a bit because I know, Evan, you wrote a really interesting chapter, basically. It seemed to be basically about why we hate the Enterprise theme so much, which I think most people do, but it's quite interesting to kind of go into why that is, like how it offends on so many levels. But again, maybe that was kind of its time, and the Discovery music feels very much like it's of its time, and the TOS music, I assume, was of its time, but they're very different. I mean, Gerald Fried, you mentioned, who I think died just this week, past week, right?
2 days ago, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, really massively influential, and maybe more so because in that era because they reused those musical cues. It's not just in one episode, albeit a great iconic episode, but it comes up again and again. And that obviously is something that I suppose, I don't know, I always feel going back to TOS and much more so as well, going back to the animated series where they only seem to have about 3 or 4 cues and they reuse them like several times in every episode. I don't know, it sort of feels like it sort of draws attention to itself more because you recognize it. Do you know what I mean? And you get that a little bit with themes like you mentioned the Romulan theme in season 1 of Picard. I don't know if this is a spoiler. We're going to get the Klingon theme, which I do recognize, long-time Trek fan, in season 3 of Picard, probably for obvious reasons. There are these little kind of, almost like a bell ringing or something. We had it in season 1 of Picard with 7 and 9 when she first appeared. We get a bit of the Voyager theme. I mean, I'd be interested to know what you guys feel about this from a kind of, musicology perspective. As a fan, I sometimes feel like those moments actually take me out of it a little bit. If it's too much of a kind of, I was going to say a dog whistle. I mean, that has all kinds of connotations that I'm not really going for, but it is that kind of element, isn't it? If it's like, we'll do this little thing and it will really get your attention somehow.
I think the word you're looking for is fan service.
Yeah. And obviously there wasn't much of that at all in that kind of Berman era, where, like you say, it was meant to be the wallpaper and you didn't really notice it. Now, I guess now, and maybe this is what you were saying, Evan, about Jeff Russo having more freedom and the other composers having more freedom to draw attention to the music a little bit more.
So there's certainly an art to it. I think you're right. Like when those little like musical Easter eggs pop up, meant to be noticed, right?
Yeah.
And so Russo has to be careful, right? And I'm sure he's doing this in conjunction with the directors and the producers, right? There's Kurtzman, et cetera. But there are moments, right, where the music, they can do something with the music to highlight something, right? But then they have to, be careful because it can get in the way. And I mean, that really goes for any sort of film or television, right? Like for the most part, the music isn't meant to be consciously heard, right? It's something that's supposed to like lead our emotions, lead our the way that we feel about the characters on the screen, how we interpret things, right? And so you're not supposed to be like actually listening to it, but when you get a little Easter egg like that, that's when they want you to notice, right? And then it disappears quite quickly, right? Because the narrative moves on fairly quickly. I mean, then there's also, what they've been doing with the different series in terms of creating something that is very progressive and in line with kind of progressive science fiction and progressive Star Trek, which, originally Star Trek was pretty darn progressive. But then also at the same time producing Star Trek that is also very nostalgic, right? There has been this tension in, since Discovery started, between new Trek and old Trek, right? But I don't know, Evan, if you have thoughts that you want to add on the.
Yeah, I do. So in my chapter, I talk a little bit about the text as kind of being a starship, right? So if you want to think of a text as a sort of a hermetically sealed starship, a bubble of livable space going around in the vacuum, every time you go in and out, commercial break, or into the show and out at the final credits, you're going through an airlock that takes you in and out of the ship. And every time you make a reference to another series, then, or what we might call a paratext, an intertext. So then you're creating kind of an airlock link to another ship that you're going to for a short time. Every time you open that airlock, there's a chance that you might lose some pressure. And I think that's the problem, right? If you keep opening and shutting the airlock, eventually you're going to run out of air. That's one of the reasons that I think that the Faith of the Heart fails as a Star Trek theme, is because it just didn't allow fans to get into the mindset of what would they expected Star Trek to be. And then when you got into the show, you never heard that song in the underscore ever, right? It was never a part. It was not like Firefly, where the theme song essentially was also the generative of the material that you heard in the underscore. That whole thing had a sound design from the top, from the title track all the way down to the most minor cue you could think of, right? It all had that sound. But that was not the case with Enterprise, and I think that's one of the main reasons it failed. But if you're constantly referring to something else, then you end up with kind of a weaker atmosphere. And I think, particularly, I think where I thought Star Wars went wrong with this was in the standalone. What was it? Where they steal the plans to the Death Star. I forget the
Rogue One.
Rogue One. That's right. So Rogue One is like just full of fan service callbacks, and at a point it's just like, wow, like this is just, it just feels like they're like people are adding icing to the cake all the time, and it feels manipulative rather than sincere. And I think fans can sense that pretty readily.
Although then you get Lower Decks that very specifically is parody, right, at every level, and so that kind of reference is expected and is just part of tapestry. Also,
though, I would say fans' experience seems to vary. I mean, I'm maybe a bit more allergic to the most obvious kind of fan service, though I feel like there's so much of it these days. I've sort of had to make my peace with it. I mean, just talking about season 3 of Picard, generally speaking, the reviews have been incredibly positive compared to the first 2 seasons. And I actually quite liked a lot of season 1. I had massive problems with season 2. But for me, I thought it was not just a return to form, but a return to a form that was never quite there so far. But there are still quite a lot of Easter eggs and quite a lot of these little, nudge, nuggety moments. And I would prefer there were fewer of those, but I've sort of just got to the point where I kind of shrug my shoulders and think, okay, that seems to be what it means to do Star Trek these days. And though I think Evan's right, it does. I think that analogy of the airlock is a really good one. It does take you out of the story that you're supposed to be in. I think that's really interesting about Enterprise. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it in that sense, but yeah, I suppose that's true, that it exists in a different world from the show, more so than the other series themes. And the fact that they have another theme at the end of the show, which fits perfectly with the rest of the music, and which lots of people were saying, well, why isn't this just the theme of the show? This is a perfectly good Star Trek theme. I thought that one of the things I thought was really interesting in your chapter as well is how you break down the kind of different constituent elements of all those 90s Trek themes, and also how they kind of come through into the modern themes with the different kind of parts. There's the space part, there's the fanfare part. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that, because I think that's quite an interesting point of consistency between those series in the kind of Trek era that I certainly grew up in the 90s. And I think it's interesting how they turn some of those things on their head now and rebranded, and sort of there are musical elements that are part of this whole Star Trek branding. Now, every show now uses the same font for the Star Trek part of the logo. Every show uses the same little musical motif, the kind of Star Trek-y stuff that goes back to the original series, in a way that wasn't the case in the 90s. And yet there were other kind of maybe less obvious forms of connective tissue between those shows.
Yeah, well, I think so. There's 4 basic elements to any Star Trek title cue: space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the starship, whatever. Its continuing mission to seek out new worlds and new civilizations to boldly go where no one has gone before, right? So those that you use that model to kind of break down what the music should illustrate all 4 of those things in some way, shape, or form. So in the original series, Space, the Final Frontier, right? Beam, bum, bum, bum. That's right out of the beginning of Mahler's First Symphony, which is supposed to be this bucolic, open, natural setting. You can also find analogs of that in the opening of Dances with Wolves, right over the Great Plains. You also find it in Aaron Copland, Billy the Kid, same thing.
So this is a kind of wagon train element there. This is the wagon train to the stars. That's where that's coming from. That's interesting.
I want to insert there too. So that has a long history in American music. So Neil Lerner talked about this. He studied Virgil Thompson and Aaron Copland, and he identified this as like music of wide open spaces, right? They use the fourths, which are slightly larger intervals, right? So chords that are based on fourths instead of thirds to kind of create this openness. And he then identified that as being key in the Star Trek title cue and part of what is called in the original series the space theme.
So when you stack fourths together, what happens is you get a sound. I'll play it on the piano here. A lot of the fourth sounds were sounds that you had in Star Trek The Next Generation as the backdrop because they're non-committal. They're not tonal sounds. They don't sound like chords. They don't have major or minor. You don't have a sense tonally of where you are. And so you can actually have all the notes of the major scale playing at the same time, but it doesn't sound like a major scale. It doesn't sound happy or optimistic or triumphant or anything like that. It just sounds kind of ambiguous. That ambiguity is space. And then as the starship comes into focus, what happens is that all of the musical materials tend to reorganize themselves into a more traditional tonal setting where the relationships between the harmonies are familiar to viewers, whether or not they know, whether or not the viewer has the music theory to describe them. We're all expert listeners in our culture by about age 6, right? Because that's at the moment you've listened to over 10,000 hours of music. Wow. So you know what the expectations are, right? Like when people tell me they're non-experts in music, I always laugh. Everybody's a music expert. You just don't know it. So you're listening and you're processing all of this stuff. And so then everything reorganizes, and it usually reorganizes into something that is very upbeat, right? Like it's a march in the case of Star Trek: The Next Generation. It's a beguine in the case of the original series. It's a Deep Space Nine is a little bit weird in that respect, but it's got some sort of motoric. So when people complained about the kind of the Game of Thrones aspects of Discovery, I thought it was a weird criticism because there's so much motoric music going on in all of the other series. There's just kind of a weird way that we don't remember that about
there's
them.
This sense of, in the B section of all of these themes, there's this sense of travel, right? So that was the thing with the beguine, right? Especially it's got this sort of forward momentum, right, in the original series, and you get that in the B section of all of these cues.
Yeah, Goldsmith in Voyager, for instance, Goldsmith will use which is the same chord progression, the same exact chord progression as the very first 2 chords from Star Trek: The Motion Picture, right? Puts you in this moment of like, oh, we're traveling to weird, distant worlds, but none of them are that threatening, and they're actually kind of familiar. Right. So it's never, the point is never that the travel is somewhere that's really truly strange and new. It's always like strange-ish, new-ish, maybe new adjacent. Right. You know, it's the new alien of the week with a different crease in their forehead. So there's something about it, and then the expectation that it's going to come back. And that everything's going to be okay, which it obviously does, right? And so the voyages, and then you boldly go where no one has gone before, right? That's all the kind of the triumphalism and these big climaxes, these big sort of orchestral symphonic climaxes that you get. I think the trumpet solo in Voyager is a classic example. It's like one of the highest pitches ever written in a trumpet solo in Star Trek. That's a hard lick to play, by the way. Dee da dum. You gotta be able to ready to hit that thing. I'm a trumpet player, so I know. So there's all this kind of ideology that is packed into that, and then think about what happens when you deal with Where My Heart Will Take Me, which does absolutely none of those things, and gives you kind of a soft rock. I mean, we can argue till the cows come home about whether it's a good song or not. I think I'm like Team Stockholm Syndrome at this point. But the it just doesn't do what it should. And then the Discovery theme reorders things, and people were pissed off about that. I mean, they were expecting something to happen in a certain order, and it didn't happen in a certain order. And that, I think, made a lot of people feel that the fanfare when it came in was insincere.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I think it's partly, like I say, for me, when the fanfare comes in at the end, it feels a bit like this branding exercise rather than an introduction to this world somehow. And I don't know, I'm sure that's not the intention, but it does feel, and now they've got this bit at the beginning with the ship whizzing around, the kind of Delta logo, which is quite cool, and I like the way they animate it and so on. But it feels of a piece with this whole way of packaging Star Trek now as this kind of, I don't know, I suppose it is this kind of new Trek thing, and it's like, this is Star Trek, it's successful now, it's all connected. It's maybe it's a kind of post-MCU thing as well, of trying to like say this is all part of one thing, which is weird, because then at the same time they're making these shows which are extremely different from each other, much more so than was ever the case before. Like, in the 90s, I mean, yeah, DS9 was doing stuff that the other shows wouldn't do, and doing some quite groundbreaking stuff, but they were still a lot more similar than a lot of the shows we're getting now are to each other. So then with these themes, I mean, the other thing, obviously, with the Enterprise theme is then they changed it. And I mean, I don't know what you think. To my mind, they made it even worse when they kind of upped the tempo. But it's interesting, so DS9, they had they redid their theme. I don't know. I think there's a kind of implication when you change the theme that it's like a soft reboot, maybe a very soft reboot, but there is an element of a kind of soft reboot of the show. Picard, they've completely changed the theme twice now. So each season of Picard does feel like a different show, and it has not completely different, but like the first two have quite seriously different themes. The third one has a totally, I won't spoil it for you, and it's a familiar one.
That is more normal nowadays to update the theme every year, to kind of update
really?
The show. Yeah, there's some other shows that do that as well. You guys are going to be so mad at me, but I loved the Enterprise theme.
Oh my God.
I know you're going to just think I'm terrible. I thought it was just really interesting, because to me, it was a commentary. So going back to this, this soft rock, or this kind of country rock feel, was a statement on kind of like the everyman approach. Like this was the Enterprise at the very beginning, right? This was the entrepreneurs that kind of made it happen, and they're just now putting their foot out into the great unknown, right? Like, so that's, for me, I was like, okay, what they're trying to connect to is that sort of, for better or worse, trying to connect to that everyman feeling. And then it didn't work out for reasons that I think Evan is completely correct about. Like, I understand why people didn't like it, but for me, I was like, oh, I get what they're trying to do. Like, it made sense.
There's this kind of folksy.
Yeah.
I mean, are we meant to think this is what's going on in Archer's head somehow?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It fits with his personality somehow. Right?
Yeah, it does. Well, I mean, and I think I think Russo with the Discovery theme, I think what he was trying to depict was what they were doing with the visuals, really, which this idea of like, because this is this is between Enterprise and the original series. This is like all of the threads are coming together slowly, right? And so they were presenting different parts of the motifs from that we would associate with Star Trek, but in little parts. And then at the end, it comes together into the fanfare, right? And so for me, I was seeing that sort of like that building, right? The building of that fanfare. However, I think what Evan's talking about, the fact that that's not what fans were expecting, right? So it doesn't quite work the way, even if they had like an intention, it didn't quite work the way they meant.
I think it would have worked better if they'd gone with it, if they committed to it, right? If that had somehow been in the underscore as well. Because I mean, if you look at who was doing the underscore, it was exactly the same people who'd been working on Voyager. So they, for all the talk, if you read the 25-year missions, like the kind of oral histories of Star Trek, they all talk about how they needed something new at that point. Berman and Braga were exhausted and they wanted to do something completely different. Well, how different was it? If they wanted to do something different, what they probably should have done is stepped aside. No offense to them, but they had, I think that was their vision, and if you still have the same people doing the same thing, whether you change in a sense, it's like a misfire, right? It's a miscue. It says, yes, we're going to do something different, but then you get into the show and you realize, it's actually not all that different to begin with, right? It's still the same kind of underscore. It's still the same kind of stories. I mean, I actually think the writing in Enterprise was some of the best writing that happened in the 90s, and it happened in the 2000s. But it was really, I thought some of those shows were extremely good. And really compelling. Just the entrance music. The entrance music wasn't. I don't hate it either. I guess I don't take myself as a fan too seriously. And I think if you think about it, if fans had the amount of power they have today, back when the Next Generation started, the Next Generation wouldn't have lasted a year. Right? Some shows need time to mature, and I remember watching, because it was on TV. I was a kid, and I remember watching it and being like, and then picking it up again in season 3. Well, no kidding. Yeah. Right. Yeah. The Borg. And then suddenly it was amazing. And it just needed to find its way. But we're not patient anymore with that kind of stuff. People were already throwing Discovery under the bus after one episode. And it seems to me I didn't like Picard season 1. And so I've been sort of reticent to go to season 2 because I've heard that it's worse. And
just skip to season 3 though, because that's the sad thing is, this is like 3 and done. So it's a show that finds its feet in season 3, but that's all you get. So and Enterprise only got 4 seasons, and by the time it got to season 4, people would have happily watched a few more of them. It's just that the kind of nails were in the coffin by then, I guess. One of the things that I thought was interesting in your book as well is you've got a foreword by Jay Chataway, who obviously scored a load of those 90s series. I think possibly more. Did he write more music for Trek than anyone else? He's got to be up there. Anyway, he's like one of the top scorers. And he was definitely one of those kind of points of consistency. He was one of the kind of wallpaper composers, if you know what I mean, after Ron Jones was given the boot for doing too much kind of weird, quirky stuff. But it was interesting. He talks in that preface about the opportunities when he did get to write music that draws attention to itself a little bit more, like, for example, the Reskin flute music. And also he mentioned, say, A Fistful of Datas, which is an episode I love, and obviously has all the kind of Western music in there, Alman Bashir, these kind of holodeck shows where suddenly, so it's not the diegetic music. I mean, there may be some of that. I can't even remember if I feel like in my head, A Fistful of Datas has some kind of honky tonk piano going on in there. I don't know whether it really does or not, but I suppose it's because the music is kind of signaling this kind of genre shift or a kind of pastiche. It's allowed to draw attention to itself. And even in Bada Bing, Bada Bang, I think don't you get there the DS9 theme repurposed? Am I imagining this? In the way, like in the original series, you hear the original series theme as a bit of like background music at a party at one point, don't you? Maybe I'm wrong. My memory is that they kind of reworked DS9 music in the style of that era. So that's not to say that the characters can necessarily hear it, but it kind of is bridging that gap somehow, or kind of questioning that distinction.
Yeah, it does the same in the ones where Picard is the detective. Same
Dixon
thing,
Hill.
right? Dixon Hill. And then there's the Royale, one of my favorite early episodes, Star Trek The Next Generation. Just hearing
That's
Data
such a weird
say,
one.
Daddy needs a new pair of shoes is like one of my favorite lines.
Yeah.
But I think that's one of the great things about the holodeck, though, is it allows the show to kind of have a show within a show and make that genre shift, right? Kind of, it can make it's kind of like a Steam release, right? You can go into that and have your own little kind of parody or even some very serious shows. But it kind of lets them explore something very, very different. I know some people really dislike the Johnny Rocket takeoff. Oh, the Captain Proton from Voyager. But for me, those are great moments because they're kind of like standalone. They're kind of they're just kind of their own little bottle episodes, right? But they really allow for that kind of creativity. I mean, this happens in a lot of television. They did it in the original series too. With their Western shows or their comedy, the Tribble Show, that sort of thing that allowed them to kind of step away and do something different.
It's also an interesting, I think it interestingly tracks onto postmodernism as a philosophical paradigm that people had in the 90s, for instance, where it's like all things kind of exist simultaneously, which obviously is a result of high fidelity recording and people living longer lifespans, and so there's sort of more overlap between the generations. And I remember when I was in the 90s, we were all swing dancing. That was a big thing, and that works its way into Star Trek as well. And it's interesting, as we talked about in the book, Star Trek is always sort of taking the temperature of where we're at, and I think you see a lot less of that in the new shows. Maybe more in like the funny ones, like the like Lower Decks or something. But I think of Voyager, or not Voyager, I mean Discovery. Discovery is a very serious score. It may refer to other Trek scores, but it's not doing a lot of like, oh, here now is a jazz number, and now we're going to do a sort of a scene setting thing. That's not the interest there. The interest is to connect it to the rest of the franchise and to make something sort of organic and coherent. And I'm kind of curious what that means about our culture. Because Star Trek is so good at being like right on the cusp of like, where are our anxieties? What are we really worried about?
Well, Star Trek in a way right now is kind of on the cusp of where we are socially and politically, because it's got so many different shows out. So it's touching on all of these different sort of like, you can think of them like social political needs or social political ideologies or ways of looking at the world. Right? Because Discovery is very different from Strange New Worlds. Like Strange New Worlds was written as a response to the fans who loved Captain Pike because it was going back to the optimism of old Trek, right? But Discovery is really expressing this sort of, the world is gray. It's not black and white. You can't have a leader who is fully good. Like everyone is flawed, right? Which is also part of what's going on in our society, especially in the 21st century, the last couple of decades, right? And so
and everyone is traumatized.
Yeah, and everyone's traumatized. Yeah. So there's this, and then you've got, Prodigy, which is, to be fair, I've only seen part of the first season, so I can't really comment fully on that. But then you've got Lower Decks, right? Which is kind of letting out sort of the, it again is a steam valve, right? That's kind of like letting out the humor that we need to let out, right? So I feel like instead of one show that's kind of carrying the social and political issues of the day, they've got these multiple vehicles that are addressing different perspectives or different needs, even really, which I think is really fascinating. And it happens in the music too, right? Because you're going to get more of the old Trek scoring in Strange New Worlds, right? This sense of like using musical topic or specific themes that are associated with specific characters that you got in the original series, as opposed to, Discovery, which is a much more serious score, like Evan was saying, as opposed to, Lower Decks, which is, in many ways, it's not always parodying, but it has many moments of parody or reference, right? So yeah, I don't know. That's what popped into my head when you guys were talking about that. I think Star Trek is really fascinating, like most science fiction, right? Because science fiction is commenting on who we are as a society and who we want to be, right? And I think Star Trek has always been a part of that. And whether you see a certain series as progressive or not, it's a part of that. And then right now we just have like this sort of plethora of Star Trek that's really kind of maybe showing how all of our different, our needs and our perspectives,
I think that's such a great point, because it also reminds us that Star Trek is a creature of the commercial market. Yeah. And that's something that I think we all tend to forget, because it has such a beautiful message, and it's a message that appeals to many of us for its kind of egalitarian vision of a utopic future. But it's still a product of our present. And that as a product of our present, it has to appeal to as many different markets as possible. And the reality of now is that there aren't monolithic markets anymore. You're all sort of going for niches all over the place. So it makes sense to have a property that has different extensions in different ways. And I'm sure, as Simon Frith would remind us, that music and social identity are so closely intertwined that you're going to tailor that music to the social identity that you're targeting. It would surprise me none at all to know that they had exactly in mind who each show was aimed at.
I guess that's the thing, is there's two audiences for each of these shows. So presumably the way they think about it is Prodigy gets the kids. I don't know, like the Section 31 show, if it ever happens, gets the sort of gritty, like 18 to 25 dark young people, maybe. I don't know. I mean, but at the same time, then there's also the audience of Star Trek fans who traditionally were I know like Next Generation broke out and became a mainstream hit, but like a lot of Star Trek has kind of relied on not pissing off enough fans that they don't turn out, and then that's when it goes off the air. Do you know what I mean? When you lose the fans. And maybe that's why there's so much nostalgia, because there is this kind of, maybe this fan service comes out of a kind of anxiety. I don't know. And I feel like sometimes it works. I really loved Strange New Worlds. I loved the show, and and of all the Trek shows, it's the one I was the least looking forward to, because I felt it was totally superfluous. But actually, I think they did a really good job on it. And I also think on the music, I liked the compromise where they kind of gave you the TOS theme, but then they did something else as well. And that seemed to represent the show. Whereas in the instances where they just, like end of season 1 of Discovery, they just gave you the TOS theme, that feels cheap to me. And everyone loved it. And everyone was like, wow, it's the Enterprise. Wow, it's TOS theme. We're like, well, that's not, I don't know. That didn't impress me.
They gave us the TOS
you know what I mean?
Because of the Enterprise, though, right?
Yeah. No, I know, but right. It's like, but it's almost like, it is almost this kind of thing of saying, yeah, this was a dark season. We know you found it a bit tough. Like in the last 10 seconds, here's
thanks for sticking with us.
Here's something that will just kind of cheer you up, and then some music that makes you feel like it's all okay. And we haven't really ruined Star Trek or whatever it is they thought people were worried about. I don't know. It feels kind of cheap.
For me, it was actually explained why the fanfare showed up in the title cue. The whole season, I was like, why is the fanfare there? And then at the end of the season, I was like, oh, now that makes sense. So for me, it actually kind of linked something that I thought was maybe slightly cynical branding to something that was to something that sort of made more sense. So actually, for me, it was more like, oh yeah, okay, I get this now. But I can understand. I definitely understand your point of view. Why you might feel sort of suspicious about it.
I guess the whole thing about music in TV and film is that it's, on the one hand, we want it to be kind of authentic somehow, but on the other hand, we're aware it's there to manipulate us, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? Insofar as like film in general is trying to manipulate us, the music is a massive part of that, of kind of tugging on the right strings on the audience to kind of get the reaction you want.
Telling us what we should think of a certain character or certain character's actions. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh yeah, and I would just say that was the whole point of Reba's chapter, where it's like, here's this beautiful utopia, but actually the music's telling you something quite different about it. It is strange, and it's I keep in my head keep coming back to the score for Star Trek the Motion Picture, which I consider to be probably the best movie score, one of the greatest movie scores of all time. Sure. I think of that movie as a symphony, which just happens to have a Star Trek movie playing at the same time. But that's also an exercise in nostalgia. It's sort of Januarian, right? It's looking forward because it has that whole new theme, but at the same time, there's this like really long scene where they approach and go around the Enterprise and look at it from all angles. And I mean, you don't miss a speck of that starship by the time you board, right? But that's also like a deeply nostalgic moment. And you think about how people might have been feeling at the time, people who never thought they'd ever see Star Trek again. That's pretty powerful. And I think that's evergreen in Star Trek because, Kurtzman himself even talks about how it goes through these cycles of cancellation and then revisioning and then rebooting. And that cycle happens, in his view, roughly every 10 years. And 10 years is a ginormous amount of time when you think of musical codes and what's popular and what's not popular.
10 years is a long time. On the other hand, Discovery came out in 2017, right? So, 10 years will come around sooner than we think. You know what I mean? I don't know what's there. I sort of assumed they have a longer term plan this time around. They seem they always seem to be planning so far ahead. I don't know. I guess we'll see, and we'll see where, as much as there seems to be all this looking back and all this nostalgia and so on, whether in the shows or the music, we're constantly getting new Star Trek shows. Picard's going to be off the air soon. There's going to be a spot opened. I don't know if Michelle Yeoh wins an Oscar. I don't know whether that Section 31 is ever, probably they can't afford her anymore. But, there's going to be something, isn't there? There's going to be Star Trek Janeway. There's going to be a 7 of 9 show. Whatever they decide to do, they're going to find a way to keep, kind of making sausage. One of the things that fans have consistently been saying they wanted, and they still haven't got really, they were sort of starting to get it with Picard, was, we want the continuation of that story, of that kind of the Star Trek story, whether it's in the 23rd century, 24th century, that kind of continuity. We don't want the jump necessarily to where Discovery is way in the distant future. We want to know what happens in the early 25th century. Now, okay, we're going to get a bit of that with Picard. Surely after that, they can do a new show that doesn't rely so much on pre-existing characters. Maybe they have one or two. I don't know, like DS9 had a little bit of a link like that. And then maybe we get something that it does feel a little bit more new in that sense. And it'll be interesting to see musically what they take forward into that, if they have to develop a theme that is not in any way referencing something else. So, probably it will be one way or another.
Well, they're always creating these themes that don't reference others. It's just we're not going to notice those as much because that nostalgia isn't like there, right? So sometimes those themes, they stick out to us as being fantastic. And those are the ones, kind of like the fight theme from the original series, right? And yeah, no, I agree. I am so looking forward to, like, the thing I love about Star Trek is that it's forward thinking, right? Mm-hmm. And right now, I think maybe our society we are in a nostalgic move in our society right now, like the, Stranger Things and like all of these shows that are kind of looking back to the 80s and the 90s, especially right now. And that's just kind of where we are kind of in our entertainment right now. So I'm totally looking forward to, Star Trek continuing to break new ground, both in terms of narrative and story and in music.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to the two of you. And as I say, it's a really fascinating book. Do you want to just let our listeners know where they can, I don't know, can they get hold of a copy or read it in a library, or what's the best way for them to access these really interesting essays?
Well, it's definitely available in some libraries, but if you want to buy your own, it's actually not too expensive as a paperback. Easiest place is Amazon, but you can also look at Taylor and Francis online, and you can buy it there as well, just directly from the publisher.
You're blended, all right.